Something was disclosed at an Israeli Defense Forces press conference last week that should have dominated every front page on the planet. It did not. It was buried inside a technical briefing, surrounded by enough institutional language to ensure that most people who heard it did not fully absorb what was being said. But the analysts who were paying attention understood immediately. The implication was not tactical. It was structural, because what the IDF confirmed in their own words from their own data is that approximately 50% of the ballistic missiles Iran has launched since the opening of this conflict were equipped with cluster munition warheads. And if you understand what that single admission actually means for the mathematical foundation of Iron Dome, David's sling, and the Arrow system combined, then you understand why the most sophisticated layered missile defense architecture ever constructed is now facing a challenge. It was never designed to survive. Subscribe to From Report right now and activate the notification bell, because what follows is the analysis that no mainstream outlet has assembled in full, and the operational picture it reveals is considerably darker than any official briefing has communicated. To understand why the cluster warhead disclosure changes everything, you need to understand how Iron Dome was engineered to think. The system operates on a kill chain logic that begins with radar detection, moves through trajectory calculation, and ends with interceptor launch time to destroy an incoming warhead at a precise point in space. Every component of that chain assumes one fundamental condition, that the incoming threat is a single object following a predictable path toward a single point of impact. Strip that assumption away, and the entire mathematical architecture of the interception sequence becomes unstable. Cluster munitions were designed by military engineers specifically to strip that assumption away. A cluster-armed ballistic missile approaches the target zone looking identical to a conventional warhead. The radar sees one object. The trajectory algorithm calculates one impact point. The interceptor is launched toward one location. And then, at a programmed altitude, the outer casing fractures. What was one object becomes 30, 40, sometimes 60 independent submunitions, each carrying several kilograms of high explosive, each descending along a slightly different trajectory, each now requiring its own separate interception solution across a dispersal radius that can reach 10 square kilometers. The Iron Dome battery that just successfully calculated and launched against a single target is now facing an arithmetic problem it cannot solve. No current missile defense system deployed anywhere on Earth has the simultaneous tracking and engagement capacity to intercept dozens of independent submunitions released in a single dispersal event. That is not an operational failure. It is a physics constraint, and Iran has been exploiting it at near-daily frequency since February 28th. The Foundation for Defense of Democracies published a technical assessment on March 11th that reinforced the IDF admission with analysis that the defense procurement community found deeply uncomfortable. As Iranian launchers face progressive degradation from airstrikes, the assessment concluded, cluster warheads allow each surviving missile to produce exponentially greater battlefield effect. The logic is precise and brutal. Fewer launches, dramatically larger impact footprint. The air campaign that was supposed to exhaust Iranian offensive capacity has instead accelerated a targeting shift that makes every remaining Iranian missile more dangerous per unit than the missiles that came before it. This is the dimension of Iran's adaptation strategy that official characterizations of degraded capacity have consistently failed to account for. When the Secretary of Defense stated publicly that Iranian offensive capability had been reduced to a fraction of its former strength, the metric being used was launch volume. Launch volume is the wrong metric. The relevant metric is impact area per surviving launch. And on that metric, the trajectory is moving in exactly the wrong direction. There is an additional complication that receives almost no attention outside specialized military reporting, and it is the detail that transforms a difficult operational challenge into something approaching an impossible one. Even when a cluster-armed missile is successfully intercepted by an Iron Dome or Arrow battery before the dispersal event occurs, the kinetic energy of that interception does not vaporize the warhead. It fractures the casing. And when the casing fractures under impact rather than under programmed dispersal, the submunitions do not scatter in a controlled pattern toward the target zone. They scatter in every direction from the point of interception. The defense system registered a successful kill. The radar logged it as a hit. But across several square kilometers beneath the interception point, submunitions are now descending unpredictably toward population zones, infrastructure, open roads. The binary mathematics of missile defense, hit or miss, does not have a category for this outcome, and yet it is an outcome that cluster munitions produce with regularity regardless of whether the intercepting system performs exactly as designed. In the town of Yehud, just outside Tel Aviv, 2 construction workers were killed, and a third was critically wounded by submunitions from a single cluster missile. These workers were outdoors when the alert sounded. They never reached shelter. Emergency responders described arriving at multiple overlapping blast zones only meters apart. Not one crater, but dispersed explosions distributed across a wide surface area. The pattern was not consistent with a conventional missile impact. It was consistent with fragmentation descending from altitude across a broad radius. This is what 50% of Iranian ballistic launches have been delivering since the beginning of this conflict. And the Israeli public has been told repeatedly that the threat is 90% neutralized. Reports indicate that senior defense officials across multiple coalition partners have begun acknowledging privately what the public briefings have been reluctant to state directly, that Iran's switch to cluster arm delivery has fundamentally altered the calculus of interception success. Intelligence sources familiar with the assessments describe internal conversations about whether the current definition of a successful intercept requires revision, given that a technically successful hit no longer guarantees neutralization of the threat. That conversation has not reached official press conferences. It has not reached the daily briefings that shape public understanding of how this conflict is progressing. What has reached the public is the 90% figure, repeated with confidence, while the sky over central Israel demonstrates something considerably more complicated on a nightly basis. The strategic logic behind Iran's cluster munition deployment connects directly to a broader targeting doctrine that defense analysts have begun describing as a blinding strategy. Rather than focusing exclusively on the assets being defended, the operational pattern emerging across this conflict reveals a systematic effort to degrade the systems that make interception possible in the first place. The New York Times published an analysis on March 11th using satellite imagery and verified video footage, identifying at least 17 American military-related facilities damaged across the Gulf region. 11 of those sites were confirmed American military installations in Qatar, Kuwait, and Bahrain. Several had been struck more than once. Satellite imagery showed damage near radar domes and parabolic antenna arrays positioned adjacent to TPY-2 radar systems, the tracking backbone of THAAD missile defense batteries. Those radars are the eyes of the entire interception network. When radar tracking is degraded, interceptor missiles cannot accurately calculate their firing solutions. The interception mathematics breaks down at the source. Cluster warheads overwhelm the system on the terminal end. Radar strikes blind the system on the detection end. Both approaches target the same vulnerability from opposite directions, the assumption that the defensive architecture can track what it cannot see and intercept what it cannot predict. Iran is not attacking the shield. Iran is attacking the conditions that make the shield function. The political consequences of this operational reality are compounding in ways that no official communication has been willing to address honestly. More than 100 countries have signed international agreements specifically prohibiting cluster munitions because of their indiscriminate nature. Iran, Israel, and the United States are not signatories to that convention. The decision by each party to remain outside the legal framework prohibiting these weapons was made in precisely the anticipation of scenarios like the one now unfolding. What that shared non-signatory status means in practice is that the operational constraints that might otherwise have governed cluster munition use in a conflict involving civilian population zones do not apply here by force of law. They apply or do not apply by force of military calculation alone. And the military calculation currently in place on the Iranian side is that cluster arm delivery maximizes battlefield effect per surviving launch platform while remaining within the operational parameters Iran has established for itself. That calculation is not changing. And the gap between official narratives of degradation and the observable reality of nightly bombardment will continue to widen for as long as the calculation holds. Here is where we stand. Israel's layered missile defense architecture, the most sophisticated ever fielded in active combat, is facing an adversary that has restructured its remaining launch capacity around the specific vulnerability that cluster dispersal creates. The IDF's own disclosure confirms that half of Iranian launches since the conflict began have used this methodology. The Foundation for Defense of Democracies confirms that degradation of Iranian launchers accelerates rather than reverses the strategic utility of cluster munitions per surviving platform. Intelligence officials describe internal reassessments of what interception success actually means when a technical hit produces uncontrolled submunition scatter. And the public in Israel and internationally continues to receive 90% degradation figures while construction workers in Yehud are killed by submunitions from missiles that no briefing adequately accounted for. The operational gap between the narrative and the reality is not closing. It is widening with each wave, and the system being tested is not just Iron Dome. It is the institutional credibility of every government that has staked its public communication on the claim that the threat has been substantially neutralized. Subscribe to Firm Report and turn on notifications. When the next IDF technical disclosure reveals what the previous wave of cluster munitions actually produced on the ground, the analysis will be here. When the defense procurement response to the cluster warhead challenge takes shape in the form of emergency contract modifications and emergency capability requests, the analysis will be here. When the political cost of the gap between public narrative and battlefield reality becomes impossible for any government in this coalition to continue absorbing, the analysis will be here. Evidence first, analysis second. What it means for you, always.